Keel Hunt is a political consultant and speechwriter and recounts the removal of Tennessee Governor Ray Blanton from office in 1979, next on BookTV. The author reports that the former three-term governor was taking money for political pardons. This is a little over an hour.
Everyone, tonight we've all come together to relive a moment in history. To be more accurate, we're going to live somewhere between 5 and 6 hours of history in which a dramatic transition took place at the absolute pinnacle of the government of Tennessee. We're going to begin by watching a 4-minute video that focuses on that moment that climaxed those hours, and then we're going to try to recreate that moment in history with the three panelists, with Lamar, our senator, then soon to be our governor, with Hal Hardin, who was our U.S. attorney, and with Keel Hunt, author, whose book, many of you have already gotten his autograph for that. But so we are happy to, on behalf of the First Amendment Center, I'm so happy to welcome you all here and to share what is truly unprecedented transition in government that took place all these years ago. I'd like to begin by asking how many people, I know there are some people here, you just raise your hand, how many people were in the room the night that Lamar Alexander was sworn in as governor? Lamar was. Oh, that's very interesting. And how many of you lived in Tennessee when this transition took place? So it's a subject that's familiar to you, but why don't I ask Chris Amaker to show the video now? Our heads will create small shadows, but they won't interfere with the thrust of what you're going to see. Chris?
Maybe we can move back a little bit.
Yeah.
They said that it would be above our heads.
It'll go ahead.
Okay. In just a moment, Jeff, it looks like we're going to be witnessing the swearing in of the 45th governor of Tennessee.
The Speaker of the Senate is directly behind Mr. Alexander. Ned Ray McWhorter is directly behind him. The Attorney General is following, and Gentry Crowell is right behind them. We're expecting him to be sworn in right now. We are live at the Tennessee State Supreme Court.
These are not very happy days for Tennessee. This is not a happy day for me. I believe, though, that we have been responsible and that we have kept the faith with the people by this decision. We seek the people's wisdom. If we hear the people's wisdom, our days of agony can soon go forward to days of pride. I ask for the prayers of the people. Mr. Chief Justice, I am ready to take the oath of office.
Please place your left hand upon the Bible, raise your right hand, and repeat after me. I, Lamar Alexander.
I, Lamar Alexander.
Well, as you saw live on Channel 5 at 5:55 p.m., the state of Tennessee received a new governor, Governor Lamar Alexander. The ceremony was held in the State Supreme Court building with Chief Justice Joe Henry presiding, and was preceded by brief statements by a governor-elect at that time, Lamar Alexander, stating why he was doing what he was doing and taking the oath of office. Standing by his side, the Democrats John Wilder, Ned Ray McWhorter, and then the oath of office administered by Chief Justice Joe Henry of the State Supreme Court. Honey Alexander, his wife, you see to Governor Alexander's right, holding the Bible and the administration of the oath.
United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations. Let us pray. Almighty God, There is no more solemn responsibility than the responsibilities of government. Guide us in our decisions. Help us to understand thy will and respond to it. Bless the state. Bless our new governor. Direct him and all our public officials to provide the leadership and the quality of government which our people deserve. Help us to govern in the true spirit of thy word. Amen.
Governor, with only 3 days left in Governor Blanton's term, why was it so imperative that you take office now?
The United States Attorney from the Middle District of Tennessee called me at noon and said he had substantial reason to believe that Governor Blanton was about to let out of a state prison one or more persons who were the targets of a grand jury investigation into alleged payoffs in connection with pardons and paroles. With that information, I concluded immediately, as I suppose the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor must have too, that that was new and specific information that demanded that I act if I could.
What's your feeling tonight?
Well, I think it's in many ways a very sad moment in Tennessee, but in many other ways it's a great moment. It will be recorded that Ray Blanton was his own worst enemy. I think he brought this on himself. I don't think there was any other viable choice. I think the United States Attorney today did what he had to do, and when they heard from the United States Attorney, I think that Lamar Alexander and the rest did what they had to do.
The Attorney General, who assured me during the afternoon that if I took office under these circumstances, it was constitutionally valid as an assumption of office. After the information had been presented to each of us, we talked by telephone and agreed that this would be in the best interest of the people. That's, from my perspective, how this occurred.
We now have Dave Keeler standing by at the State Supreme Court building with Lieutenant Governor John Wilder for an interview.
When the United States District Attorney called myself and Mr. McWhirter and Governor Alexander and advised us that he had certain information that led him to believe that there were a number of persons that were going to be pardoned and or commuted shortly, we had no choice, so we acted.
When did Governor Blanton find out that this ceremony was going to take place?
I'm advised that he was advised of this shortly before it happened by Attorney General Leach.
Hank Allison is standing by there with the Speaker of the House, Ned Ray McWhirter. Hank?
The man you just swore in is a Republican. You are a Democrat, and most of the people who participated in the decision to swear him in early are Democrats.
First, I'm a Tennessean, and I think this is in the interest of Tennessee, regardless of the party.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, could Frank's got a book right there. I just want to put the book up here so everybody can see how young Lamar and Ned and John were. Joe Henry looked old even then. Well, I saw among you so many hands raised. There may be 3 people who were not in this room who were not in Tennessee, and so I don't need, I think, to delve in much of the history that preceded the moment we just saw on the screen. But as you know, it was called in the media, it was called the Pardons for Cash scandal. And we had seen in the days and hours immediately preceding these last 5 or 6 hours, we had seen multiple pardons signed by the governor. Governor Blanton had indeed announced that he had signed many of those. Within weeks, at least 2 members of his administration had been arrested. One, a lawyer on his staff, was arrested after marked bills were found on his person. You could tell from watching that video that John Wilder and Ned McWhirter, Democrats, were both deeply concerned about what had been going on, and the media had been reporting almost on a daily basis. Television, we saw Chris Clark there, sometimes on an hour-to-hour basis, and there were grave concerns. There were grave concerns that we had not seen the end of this. Here we are on Monday. Lamar Alexander is going to be sworn in as a Republican governor on Saturday. I think every official in government was holding his breath, worried about what would come next. And now Keel Hunt has, with this book called Coup, he has, in ways I never thought I would envision, he has brought that story together. Not just the story of those few hours, focuses on that, but through almost 200 interviews.
Thank you for coming.
You know how it is when I mention Keel's name, the lights go out. I'm not going to mention it again.
Because there was a power surge.
Oh. Yes. So let's begin with the story. This is the background, and I read the book. I thought I knew everything about what happened that day. I read that book, and it was like getting an education. It's a vital and valuable piece of history, Keel. But after all this time, why did you do it?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I could not be honored more than for you to have written the foreword to this book. John was my editor. And, you know, look where we all are sitting tonight, and this is just a great thing. And I thank you for that and what you wrote. The book, you know, I also want to say something else, because as I look around this room, a lot of the people in this room have been the most important people in my life and career, and that is an absolute truth. I thank you all, starting with my family who are here. Marcia Hunt, my wife, not only my muse, but the love of my life. Our daughter Shannon Hunt and her daughter Olivia was here earlier, and they're in town this weekend from Washington, D.C. My colleague Zach Hunt, who is also my son, and I just want to single them out because I can. Thank you all. John, I wrote this book for two reasons. I've thought about this. Why did I do this? Two reasons mainly. One is I like a good story. I enjoy writing. I have all my life. And this just struck me as a pretty darn good yarn. I mean, this is a very compelling story. It's also true. It's and I hope it reads like this. But it struck me at one point. It's almost like a novel. You know, it's almost stranger than fiction. How some of these things happened in the interrelationships of people and leaders and so forth. And so, first of all, it just struck me as a pretty cool story. And I hope you'll think so if you read the book. The other reason was that after reflecting, after talking with these fellas and a number of other people who are in the room tonight, there were 163 interviews over a period of time, that what struck me most of all was that this is a very timely story for the age in which we now live, which tends to be so contentious. I mean, we're sitting here with Senator Alexander, who must live in this environment that I'm describing every day. And not only in Washington, but in state capitals all over the country, and that we have a lot of rancor. There's not a whole lot of coming together. There's not a whole lot of bipartisanship. And this
and cooperative spirit amongst our elected leaders in many cases. And I just thought this was a case study of how that can happen when it happens well. It was, and that it is possible, and it's been possible in our lifetime. And I thought that was just this was an important story to know, and for people to read, and for children when the time comes for them to read it too, for that reason, because somehow in that, restoring that sort of sense of cooperation lies I think the future, the hope of our country, and certainly our communities. And I think it's just important to know. And as we saw those familiar faces on the screen, as a matter of fact, they, what struck me most of all was these were very serious partisan people, folks who had been elected. They'd worked hard for the offices they held, in one or two cases, the office they were about to lose. And but the ones who came together to solve that problem, including the U.S. Attorney, Ned McWhorter, Wilder, Bill Leach especially. These were people who were very partisan people, and they didn't want to do this, and yet they came together in, as you say, that period of 5.5 or 6 hours, and they did this thing because it needed to be done. It was a public safety emergency potentially, and I thought that. So that's the story. That's the second reason I wrote the book.
Thank you, Keel. I was honored to be asked to write the foreword. I'm delighted I did. It's. Let me see if I can try to set the scene. As I think of it, Hal Hardin, you are the United States District Attorney for the Middle District, Tennessee. You also were the first judicial appointment, the first judge appointed by Governor Ray Blanton. On this morning, you're at the Federal District Courthouse, and you've been reading the papers, but a good deal more than that. You've been reading FBI reports, and you've been talking to FBI agents. And they understand what's going on, and you understand what's going on. And now it appears there is a very real crisis. The book tells definitively what you did, but would you just, for the audience, recount where you were that morning, what led you to do what you did? You pulled the trigger that started this series of events that led to this unprecedented transition of government. Talk to us about that.
Well, as Honey Alexander said, this was the worst day of her life, I believe she said, and I think it was kind of the worst day of everybody's life that was involved in. It was not a happy thing, but that day was really the last 3 days before that. Starting that Saturday, there was information coming in that that tomorrow, Monday, there's going to be a lot of people let out of the penitentiary, some of whom were suspects.
Now, intelligence, that's FBI.
From the FBI. That was on a Saturday. And then kind of fast forward on Monday night, the governor at midnight signed 52 pardons and commutations. And my recollection is that 24 of those people were convicted murderers, and it just wasn't all murder is horrible, of course, but some of it was torture and poison and things like that. And these were people that had already been rejected by the board of parole and pardons and so forth, and it was incredible that they were going to be released. I mean, it was astounding. It was something that really made national news. Some of the people were, as I say, were suspect, but then we had the Attorney General's opinion to come down that Monday, which said, and it was written by Trip Hunt, well, the Attorney General Bill Leach was in Washington arguing before the Supreme Court, that it was legal for Victor Ashe, I think Victor.
Yeah, could I just,
Victor there.
Well, we said so many people who played a role here.
Right.
Victor Ashe is here. Victor Ashe had written another letter to the Attorney General recognizing what had taken place, and he asks, can this happen? Is it possible for this swearing in to take place, the transition to take place?
And how soon can it happen? And you're right, Victor did ask for a lot of opinions, and thank goodness for them. And it was written by Trip Hunt, and it was not signed. And it basically said, analyzing the Constitution, that yes, the governor can take oaths anytime after January 15th. And the inauguration of the Constitution is different than the word oath. And it was unsigned, and nobody really paid much attention to that. I thought it was fascinating, but Bill Leach learned about it, apparently.
Our Attorney General, our State Attorney General, a Democrat,
as you were. Very close friend. He was in Washington, and apparently Bill asked that that be reversed. He didn't like that opinion, and he called his office, and Keel, you can tell us about that. But basically, Bill changed that opinion. So, and that worried Lamar, I think, very much. There was some question as whether or not he could take oath early. But to get to that day, I remember the day distinctly. It was a cold, dreary day, much like in your foreword about in Cambridge, that horrible day. It seemed like everything was gray and depressing, and I had been thinking about, what in the world can I do? This is really getting out of hand, and I thought about that morning how Ned McWhorter had called. I got a call like in November of the fall before, and my secretary said, the Speaker of the House is on the phone. I said, well, okay. And I pick up the phone, and he said, General, which in the country you refer to every prosecutor as a general, even though we're not. And he said, General, and I said, yes, Mr. Speaker. And he said, I just want to tell you that if you ever need me, I'm here.
Now, by this time, there already were rumbles about scandals, pardons for the pardon for cash scandal.
There was a lot of rumors, and there were a lot of
Roger Humphreys,
and the Roger Humphreys, and I saw Lee Smith here, who really revealed that, as you detail so well in your book.
So that morning, you hear from the FBI?
Yes, I had actually been pacing back and forth, and I remember I ran into the U.S. Marshal, and they were talking about it. I said, what are you going to do about all this, or what's going to happen with all this? And I said, I don't know. I don't know. And then the FBI agent with whom I had been coordinating, he came up to see me. And he said, look, we got some new information. And he was very depressed about it. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going down right now.
He's telling you this.
He's telling me this, that we got a situation where the governor is definitely going to do this. He's going to free certain individuals.
Second list.
Excuse me?
It's a second list.
Yeah, the second list of individuals, and these names, again, had surfaced before in secretly taped conversations.
So over the weekend before, more than 50 pardons have been signed. Now you're getting information. There is a second list.
Yes, and one of them on the list was a high priority for us. As I recall, he was a triple murderer, and there was already evidence from 3 separate sources on videos and tape recordings that money had already been raised, that some of the money had been raised. He had raised some of the money by having people rob crap games and raise $50,000. Also involved, the commissioner was involved in it. There wasn't much doubt that he was involved in a payoff. And the information that I received was corroborated, I thought, by everything that had gone on in the past. And I asked the FBI agent, I said, I want you to go back and verify a lot of this for me. and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "You don't want to know." I mean, so, and
you don't want to know.
You don't want to know. And, well, the reason for that was I knew then that I was going to have to call Lamar. I mean, it just.
Well, now let me just ask you. You said you knew then you were going to have to call Lamar.
Yes.
You're working for Attorney General Griffin Bell, who is in Washington. Did it occur to you you should call him and report to him?
Well, not really, because I knew I had a good relationship with him, but I knew that if I called General Bell, that number one, it takes a while to get through to him, and number two, it would have delayed the process, and he probably would have said, "Well, why don't we think about this?" Hit that deep southern drawl of his. Why don't we think about it a little more before we do anything? So I really knew that that was not an option, and I knew I had this information, and I was the only one that really had it, and I felt like I just really had no alternative but to give it to Lamar. But I realized the United States Attorney should not be dabbling in state politics. I mean, there's a great separation of power, and it's a very serious thing to overstep those lines, and for a federal official, the chief law enforcement official, to be coming involved.
How'd you get beyond that?
Well, I just thought about what's about to happen. I didn't think there was going to be any doubt about what's going to happen. I was convinced in my own mind, and I think history tells me I was right about that. Thank goodness. To me, it was really a no-brainer, if you will, because I think anybody would have done what I did if they had the same information.
So you called him?
I called him.
You called?
Yeah, but I told. I mean, I would not tell the FBI. I didn't tell my own staff, because I thought if this goes south, and there's a lot of reasons why it could go down bad, I didn't want them to be responsible at all, and there were cases going on, and I didn't want this to be a legal issue, and for that reason I think the first thing I said when I called Lamar is, "I'm not calling you as the United States Attorney, I'm calling you as a Tennessean." Thank goodness Ned agrees with that.
Were you at home when you got the call?
No, I was in the first quiet morning I'd had. I've been campaigning for governor for 5 years. Gotten beat once, walked across the state. Honey and I had gone to farewell receptions all over the state, and I was sitting in a private office on Hobbs Road above the Chonies, writing my inaugural address for Saturday, thinking that all this had passed by. You know, there'd been this huge reaction after the Monday night when Governor Blanton released 52 people and said to the Secretary of State, "This takes guts," and the Secretary of State, Gentry Crowell, said, "Yeah, some people have more guts than brains." That's right. But people were saying in your newspaper, like, he makes Nixon look like a, choir boy or something like that. That was Tuesday. And then I thought it probably settled down by Wednesday, and I thought, well, I can get to Saturday, because, we were looking forward to Saturday. I mean, we had, this sort of the beginning of a new administration. I recruited a new cabinet. I
invited people from all over the state.
All over the state. I was sort of the new custodian of the state's reputation, which was pretty badly tarred right then. And I was looking forward to that. And I remember
you're looking forward to Saturday.
To Saturday, and I remember Honey saying that day that as the day wore on, this makes it, instead of a celebration, which was Saturday, this is more like a funeral. And so I was sitting there doing some business, writing my address. I think Louis Donaldson was there. He'd come in early to be the head of finance and administration. He was in the other room, and the highway patrolman came in and said, the U.S. attorney's on the phone.
And you said?
I said, Okay, I talked to him. Now, I knew about Hal Hardin, but we really didn't know each other, right? I mean, we were friends, or we were acquaintances, but
we camped out with our
yeah.
children.
Well, but wasn't that later when our girls were Girl Scouts?
You're right.
I mean, at that
mine's here tonight.
Yeah, I mean, we were daddies taking Catherine and his daughter out to camping, but I knew him by reputation as a straight shooter, as a U.S. attorney, as President Carter's appointee, Governor Blanton's appointee, rising, you know, nobody was rising faster in the Democratic Party, and I just had a good opinion of him. So I took the call, and he told me what you just said. And I said to him something like, Hal, may I call you back in about 10 or 15 minutes?
Now, why did you say that?
Well, I said it for two reasons. One is I wanted to think for a moment about what he just said. I mean, imagine what he'd said. I mean, what he said, he asked me to take office 3 days early. And second, I want to make sure it was him. Well, you think about that. I mean, any sort of, this is before caller ID.
It could have been John Seigenthaler.
It could have been Seigenthaler. It could have been anybody. But I knew John, I mean, he said, and he and I have never talked about this privately since then. I mean, I don't think either of us understands exactly why. It's been 34 years. And we've seen each other, but we haven't ever sat down and talked about it. I just heard him say he knew he had to do something, and he knew what he had to do. And I knew when he called that I was going to have to do it. I knew that I was going to be governor before the end of the day, and I knew also that I absolutely did not want to do it, that it probably shouldn't be done for a whole variety of reasons. I said to Tom Ingram, this is the kind of thing when that 100 things can go wrong and 99 of them probably will. But so I spent the whole rest of the afternoon, the next 5 hours, trying to think of ways to keep those 99 things from going wrong, because the great concern was that it wouldn't be accepted, that the governor would find out about it. I mean, he was still head of the National Guard with 10,000 people. He had a highway patrol. He could have surrounded the Capitol. Somebody could have criticized it. You would expect they would have in a country that prizes itself on peaceful transitions. We could have made a laughing stock out of the state, and instead of being custodian of the state's good reputation or restoring its good reputation, I could have just made it worse.
Could I ask you?
Odds were high that something would not work with something like this. I mean, keep in mind, this is now a Republican state. Almost everybody in the state capital is a Republican. 34 years ago, I was the only Republican in the state.
Sure.
And I wasn't even in yet. and I didn't know these guys. I didn't know McWhorter. I didn't know Wilder. I didn't know Hal very well. I knew Bill Leach some. I mean, we were acquaintances. I knew them by good reputation, but we had not worked together.
At least part of the consideration, from what you just said, at least part of the consideration is, you know, this is going to look like a Republican, just what Keel calls it in his book, it's going to look like a Republican coup. The Attorney General of the state is Democrat, the U.S. Attorney is a Democrat, Ned McWhorter, the Speaker of the House, John Wilder, the Lieutenant Governor, they're all Democrats. Ray Blanton's a Democrat. One of the things that can go wrong is that this may be misinterpreted as a political takeover.
Can I just say on that
Sure,
point?
Please do.
The thing that I learned in doing this research was that it was so not a Republican coup. I mean, it was because of who the other principal people were. The two speakers, both very senior Democrats. It was Hal Hardin. I mean, as Lamar has just said, I mean, no Democrat in the state was sort of his star rising faster. There was talk at the time that Hal might himself run for governor sooner or later. Bill Leach, certainly a Democrat, and Joe Henry at the end of the day. But
Joe Henry, the Chief Justice,
the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who administered
who compared Winfield Dunn's election to a plague of locusts. So he was, Keel's right about that.
Bob Henry was here a little earlier, probably in the room. His brother, Joe Henry, these are sons of Chief Justice Joe Henry. Joe Jr. told me that when they were kids, their dad would, when it was time to go leave and get in the car, he'd say, "Last one to the car is a Republican." And so my point, though, is simply that what became clear to me was that at the end of the day, during that afternoon, if any one of them had said no,
that's true.
If any one of them had said no, it would not have happened.
Well, let me ask you and Hal about the two of them. They know what's going on. You had that call in October, November from Ned saying, "If you ever need my help." On the other hand, there are bound to be concerns in their mind about Constitution says get rid of the governor by impeaching him. There are bound to be concerns in their minds. We're Democrats. Do we really want to be involved in this? And more important than that, do we want to be the leaders in this? You clearly couldn't have wanted to be the leader because of all the reservations you just expressed. But what about them when you reach them, Hal?
When I first reached the speaker, I think I reached out to Governor Wilder first, or he returned my calls first. And I explained the situation to him, and he said, very reluctantly, he said, "Well, we'll stand behind Lamar." And I knew that wasn't what Lamar wanted, was somebody standing.
I was young, but I wasn't that young.
and then he said, let me get the speaker, and we'll call you back. And both of them called me, and Governor Wilder gave a lot of reasons why this wouldn't work. I said, well, I got to call in for Bill Leach, the Attorney General, and he said, I don't think Leach should be involved in it. Leach would have a conflict of interest because he represents the state of Tennessee. And then we got into a discussion on conflict of interest, and it's rapid fire. Well, you know, how are you going to do this? How are you going to do that? And theoretically, Joe Henry would administer the oath because that would give it the sanctity of the Supreme Court. He said, no, Joe Henry cannot do that. This case may come before him as a Chief Justice. And
this is Wilder.
Wilder is saying
the reasons we can't do it.
The reason we can't do it. There were a lot of reasons why we can't do this. But if worse comes to worse, we will stand behind Lamar. And and I called a speaker, and we talked.
Speaker McWhirter.
McWhirter, and he also was saying the same thing. You know, we will tell Lamar we will stand behind him. And then I got with Bill Leach, and we were all going to meet at Lamar's office out on Hobbs Road. And I was going to bring the Chief Justice with me just in case he wanted to take the oath. And and he was just recovering from a heart attack, and it wasn't in his office, but.
Bill Leach is just recovering?
No. I'm sorry. Justice Henry had just.
The Chief Justice is just recovering from a heart attack. But Bill Leach had another problem.
You'll be able to get all this straight if you just read the book.
Well, Bill Leach had a lot of problems. I mean, he had just argued before the United States Supreme Court. He had this opinion issue about whether or not this is legal, and his wife was in Baptist Hospital giving birth. And Bill had rented a room at the Sheraton. It was called the Sheraton then, right across from the courthouse, or catty corner across from it. And we discussed where we were going to meet, and we decided that we were going to meet in his hotel room, and that was kind of command central, if you will. And later on, we were joined by Bill Koch.
Could I just ask for a minute? Was the press anywhere around this?
They were in the hotel, room 416, because they wanted to avoid the press.
Yeah. They were in the room, you mean Bill
That's the reason we went there.
The lawyers were in the hotel room.
Well, I mean, we went to great lengths to get there. I mean, Bill, he took the tunnel underneath the Capitol and came out and had a driver to pull him inside the garage at the Sheraton.
Well, you were right across the street at 8th and Broad.
Well, yeah, but I walked down the hallway behind Judge Morton's courtroom, down the stairs, got in the elevator, took the elevator down to, we have a tunnel there also, went down, got in my car, drove out Franklin Road for about a mile, and then turned around, came back, and went in the hotel, just to try. Because I mean, if it become known what we were doing, it wouldn't have worked. So secrecy was.
They had Bill Leach had the hotel room because his wife Donna Leach, who is here tonight, was in Baptist Hospital about to have.
Donna Leach is here.
And the boy is too.
About to have Will, who is right there. He was born that morning.
So, you meet in the hotel room, come to conclusion?
Well, it took a long time. We laid out on the beds there. There were two little beds and one chair, and we alternated with the chair. And a lot of cigarettes were smoked in that room.
It might seem like a long time, but it could have been more than about 2 hours.
I know, but it's amazing to me how much we discussed in those 2 hours. I mean, it was rapid fire. It was Bill Koch and Hayes Cooney laying out the Constitution
from the Attorney General's office.
Attorney General's office, and you know, arguing these points point by point with the Attorney General, and talking to you, and then talking to Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker, back and forth, until finally there was a resolution, until we resolved all these issues that we had. And it wasn't a simple thing. Like, what's the oath? What exactly is the oath? Does Lamar have a tie? I mean, you know, how are we going to do it? Does the legislature need to be alerted? I mean, there are all sorts of issues that were discussed in a very short period of time.
So you're hammering that out in that hotel room.
In that hotel room.
And where are you? You know that the challenge is there. You've said, I know I've got to do it. I don't want to do it. But with whom are you talking?
Well,
I'm sure you're talking to them on the phone. But
Louis Donaldson was there, and I asked Tom Ingram to come over. And about 1:30 or so, I went home for lunch. Right, lunch, and went home to tell Honey what was going on. It was about 1:30, I guess, or 2. And that day we were moving. We had moved. That was the day we were moving from our house into the governor's mansion. So all of our stuff was transported to the governor's mansion, except a few things. The house was cold. Leslie, who is here, was sick. She was home from school that day and coughing. Honey was 4 months pregnant with Will, who was here. Drew was in school that day, and she was sitting there wondering what these men were doing. You know, I remember one time she said, "Can't somebody make up his mind?" And so I said, "Well, this is what could happen. You know, we were going to be sworn in Saturday, but it might happen this afternoon." And that presents a whole group of issues, you know. Well, we talked about, I mean, the biggest constitutional issues, we don't do that in the United States. I mean, George Washington said, if you got to Mount Vernon, they'll tell you, he said the most important election is not the election of the first president, but the election of the second. You know, whether we have a peaceful transition of power from one to the second. Many countries don't do that. We always do. So instinctively, you know, we know we shouldn't do that. Then there were these technical questions of swearing in is a legislative ceremony. I mean, I knew enough to know that, and legislatures can get very upset if you usurp their prerogatives. And then, where do you have it, and who goes? The former governor always goes to the transfer of power, but you can't tell him. He might sign all the pardons before you can get yourself sworn into office. And then you had all these people coming from all over the state who were looking forward to Saturday. And I mentioned earlier, you use this as sort of the kickoff for what you hope are 4 years of progress in the state. So I was going back and forth. I went to home, and then I went back to Hobbs Road. We talked back and forth, and I was literally thinking, what are all the things that could go wrong? I mean, the governor could. So I sent Tom to see General Wallace, who's the head of the National Guard. Well, he wanted to keep his job. He was a Democrat, so we talked to him. I mean, we needed to make sure he was loyal to me and not the guy he worked for the rest of that afternoon. I had forgotten it, but Keel found out in his book. I called Gene Roberts, who was on his way in as the head of the Highway Patrol, and I said, do you have 50 loyal members of the Highway Patrol in case we need them?
this afternoon or tonight.
Sure.
If there's a contest about who the governor is and who's literally in charge. And then we had the issue of the law, who would attend, and my thought was that we wanted to look as much like a real swearing in as it possibly could, which is why I insisted that Joe Henry come out of his hospital, not his hospital bed, but his recovery, and why I didn't want, and when McWhorter and Wilder said, you know, we'll stand behind you, I said a little earlier, you know, that's kind of like, you walk on out there and see how it is, you know, so I said, no, you invite me. That's what I told Hal, you invite me to do it. They said, no, we're not going to do that, which I understood. So the way we worked it out within about 2 hours was, I literally wrote out a statement on a piece of paper, which Hal read to them, and said, we together agree to do this together, right? Which is how we eventually did that. And that must have been resolved by 4 or 4:30. Right. And we headed down to the, I went back home again, got Honey and the kids, loaded up, off we went down to the old Supreme Court building. That was another decision. If we were to do this, where would we do it, and who would we tell beforehand? And how would people find out about it?
Well, and the last condition was you wanted me to attend, but I didn't.
That's right.
I wouldn't do that.
You didn't, but everybody else.
Could I just ask at what point Chief Justice Henry was brought into it, and because you're going to meet in his chambers, all of you, and then walk in to that Supreme Court courtroom.
Did Louis go to see him about 4 o'clock?
Yeah, Louis Donaldson, who could not be here tonight, by the way, went to see him. Later in the afternoon, Bill Koch, who is in Honolulu, by the way, tonight, celebrating Aunt Jenny's 96th birthday, went to see Justice Henry. And so there were 2 conversations about, we need you to do this. Also 2 versions, by the way, but you can read that.
Well, I called him earlier in the day also, and I said, I'd like to come by, or you come by to see me, and would you block off 3:15? And he said, okay. He never asked me why.
Well, by this time, I can remember sitting at the Tennessean office, and all morning long there was a sense on the part of the reporters covering the courthouse. I remember Larry Daughter and Doug Hall were there, and they were asking questions on the Hill, and they're onto something. And I think all the media, I think Chris Clark would say the same. No, both print and electronic media were onto something, but nobody could really get their arms around it.
They were all over town. It was amazing.
But let me add this. Louis Donaldson and Bill Koch were the 2, I would say, Alexander people who spoke to Justice Henry. Hal did speak to him earlier in the day in order to get him out to Hobbs Road at the 2 or 2:30 time frame. And about that, so that was before 2 o'clock. Larry Daughtry, may be here, told me that he went into Justice Henry's office. At that point, you could just sort of walk in the building, you know, and can't now. But Larry went into his office and saw opened on Justice Henry's desk the code that it has to do, or maybe it's the state constitution, with the oath of office. Larry said that was back when his eyesight was better, and as a reporter he could read upside down.
He could.
And he saw that it was the oath of office, and Larry thought he had it put together at that point.
Yes.
2 o'clock in the afternoon. Decision wasn't made until about 4, but he wasn't wrong.
No, that's right. And I can also remember that that Jim Kennedy from Speaker McWhorter's office called and led me to believe something was going on. I think I tried to call you, Hal, and hammer you a little bit to try to find out.
You finally did that night.
Yeah. Hal didn't hammer very well, I'll tell you.
Well, you know, another amazing thing I think about all this is that none of the participants shared this information with their spouses or anybody except their really closest.
I did.
You did, except I started saying except Lamar.
Bill Leach, he leaves Donna, his wife, out at Baptist Hospital, and he says, "I gotta go. I can't tell you why, but just watch TV." I think Donna is what he said, and when I went home that night, people said, "Well, you're here early," and I said, "Well, just watch TV." But it was not a happy occasion. I mean, nobody was jumping up and down about this. Everybody that participated was reluctant. It's never been celebrated. None of us have ever celebrated this. Bill Leach was a good friend of mine, the Attorney General, and we were out many times, and we never discussed this.
Well, I think the event's not worth celebrating. I do think the book that records the history deserves the celebration that we're giving it tonight, and that I know it's going to receive again and again. Could we just go for a moment to Justice Henry's chambers now, as that moment approaches? I suppose you're arriving one after the other. We saw from the video that all the principal players were there. Everyone, I guess they gradually gathered there. By that time, the media is in the courtroom expecting and maybe waiting for the moment, maybe still doubting that the moment's going to occur. Talk about the mood in that in Justice Henry's chambers.
Well, somber is about the only way to talk about it, and it moved fast because we didn't want anybody to know about this before it happened, because the whole point of it was to do it before the governor found out about it. And so we must have arrived about 5:30, and I was sworn in by 5:50, 5:55. And the group assembled there, and I guess there was the question, well, who's in charge of this group? And I figured, well, I guess I am. I'm about to be the governor. So I said, well, you go here, and we'll all go around here. And I asked Louis Donaldson to give the prayer, and the Chief Justice to swear me in. Honey, somehow, we had nothing left in our house, but and it sounds trivial to say it, but we had no clothes to wear. I had, because I was supposed to go down to Jackson that night myself to a thank you celebration, the last of 5 or 6. And she was moving the children into the governor's mansion, and all the clothes were there. So we had that. Somehow she had kept the family Bible out, the one that my great-grandparents used in their marriage, and so we were able to bring that. And so we walked in there, and we went pretty quickly, and we started to leave, and someone said, well, who's going to tell
now, who said
governor?
This? Does anybody remember who said this?
Keel's talked to everybody there, right?
Yeah, you mean who told Governor Blanton?
Who says, has anybody told Governor Blanton yet?
It was Lieutenant Governor Wilder. And now this actually happened in what is called the robing room of the Supreme Court building. It's just like the ante room just off the chamber.
So you're just getting ready to walk in.
Everybody's standing there about to go in and do this thing. And so Lieutenant Governor Wilder says, I mean, actually, I understand you were forming the single file. You had to go through a single door. And he says, well, has anybody told Governor Blanton about this? And the group stops. And now, Lamar's recollection was that it had already been agreed that who should tell Governor Blanton would be Attorney General Bill Leach. The more colorful story was from Speaker McWhorter.
That I don't dispute. I mean, that
right. I mean, they're not necessarily inconsistent, but he says that okay, I'll call him. I'll tell him. Ned says, and he says to Jim Kennedy, do you have his number out there on Jefferson Davis Drive? They've now moved out of the residence. Yes, sir, I do. Well, see if you can get him on the phone. So he goes, there's a black rotary phone over here in the room, and he dials the number, and Mrs. Blanton answers the phone. And Jim Kennedy says, Ms. Blanton, Speaker McWhorter is calling for Governor Blanton. Is he in? Yes, hold on. And then Governor Blanton's voice comes on. And Ned's story is that he said, Governor, this is Ned. Bill Leach has something he wants to tell you. And they get back in line and go out the door.
And Blanton's response was,
something like the hell you say.
The hell you say, yeah.
Well, the story doesn't end there, but I think that our time of telling this vital part of it, I think we've reached that point where we might go to the audience for some questions or comments.
Because we don't want to tell the whole story.
No, you don't want to. You can all get the book. If you haven't gotten it on the way in, you can get it on the way out, take it home, and go back to it tomorrow. Questions from our audience or comments? Yes, Charles Overby.
Hal, you said that John Wilder said no. Bill Leach had said no, yet it ended up being yes. What did you drop on them? What was the decisive thing you said to get them to say yes?
None of them said no exactly, but there was a reluctance and a natural reluctance to go along with something like this. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary to think about doing something like this. Bill Leach was the Attorney General, was the most receptive of all, even though his opinion just most recently was kind of left us in a quandary. But and if I had to rank them, I'd say Bill was the most supportive of it, the Attorney General. Ned, I always felt that he would go along. And I thought that Governor Wilder would come along with the rest. But the information that I told them was exactly, well, it is in more detail than what I told Lamar, but I said, here it is. I mean, here's the intelligence that we know, except for grand jury information. I can't give you that. But here's what I know, so you'll know what I know. And my point was, I don't know about the legalities of this. I mean, to fast forward the legal argument, I think it's best that if we have to litigate this in court, let's litigate it in court. But let's go ahead and do this, because if we don't, I mean, here are the consequences. And and unfortunately, it was pretty clear what the consequences were going to be, I thought, and I still think that.
The consequences, to emphasize that point, are, I knew Bill Leach well enough to have asked him before that, and I don't know when it might have been, but I asked him, does the Constitution give the governor the absolute authority to release someone from prison by commutation or pardon, and an absolute authority that cannot be overturned by anybody? He said yes. I said, does that mean the governor could empty the prisons with his pardon authority? He said yes.
You know, there's a moment when Louis Donaldson has gone up to sort of secure the state
that's
capital.
a great story. After one of the things, say you're in my shoes, what do you do? What do you do? I'm supposed to go to Jackson. I couldn't fly, so I'd drive down there. So I sent Louis Donaldson and Tom Ingram and Bill Koch to secure the state capitol. And somebody said Louis Donaldson's been waiting his entire life for someone to ask him to do that. But so they went over there, and Keel's book has a whole range of interesting stories about Governor Blanton's call, wanting to take his papers out, and about other things that were going on that night in the Capitol when many people wondered, can you really do this? There's a time in that you saw the little clip from Channel 5. Chris Clark may be here tonight, but he told me that Channel 5 at that time had one of the 2 or 3 remote broadcasts in the country. That sounds ridiculous today, but where you could actually be somewhere, and so they were the only one covering this, and they just happened to be there with their remote broadcast, and they even interrupted the Cronkite show to show it, which was an unheard of thing to do. And at one gap in that tape that you saw, Chris turns to his cohort on the set, and someone says, I didn't know you could do that. And the other guy said, well, I didn't know you could do that either. So that's what we were thinking. We didn't know you could do that. That's not the way you do things in the United States and America. So you have this tremendous natural inclination to think of all the reasons why you can't do it. Yes, you have to do it.
Question.
That's where we were.
Here.
After the swearing in, after the deed is done, in those first few hours or days, were there any offices or any persons of authority who resisted that this was in fact the done deal?
I think the shock there were some people who came to the Capitol the next morning who had not seen this on TV. There's one, is Lee Curtis here?
Lee's here.
She is one who showed up for work the next morning and didn't know this had happened. Of course, and yet their world had turned upside down.
She's the receptionist in the governor's office.
It was a very new and kind of short-term receptionist in Governor Blanton's front office, and then later worked for Governor Alexander, and has worked for state government now for 30-plus years. She's very young.
But on that question, Keel, one, based on Bill Koch's advice, I believe it was Bill's, I asked the new cabinet members to take their offices, but to make no decisions between the swearing in on Wednesday and Saturday on the new swearing in, so those decisions could not be challenged later by anybody. So we tried to minimize that. But I think the question you ask, I mean, the most miraculous thing about the whole thing is not that something didn't go wrong. That's pretty miraculous. But that nobody challenged it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the only challenge came because I took the position that if the pardons hadn't been delivered, they could. I said, lock the prison doors, don't let anybody out. Roger Humphreys got out before I locked the prison doors because that was earlier in the week, but the rest of them didn't. They sued and they got out because the courts eventually held that once the governor issues the pardon or commutation, that's it.
And if, for those of you who don't know who Roger Humphreys was, please read the book. It is Keel, you captured the drama of that story. I mean, it's a stunning story. Lee Smith was part of it. Frank Sutherland had his hand up.
Keel, with a story that has this much detail as you have in your book, you had to encounter factual conflicts. What was the biggest factual conflict that you had in your interviewing process that you had to resolve?
Whose tie was it?
Whether it was Tom Ingram's necktie or Louis Donaldson's. And I say that, I mean, that's true. And the answer was it was Tom's necktie. But we respect Mr. Donaldson. But I say that because, in fact, I was struck about how much common ground there was in the shared memories of these people 30 years later. I mean, it was astounding that how the thing happened in the afternoon in the hotel room. That I call that chapter, the title of that chapter is The Dance. You know, how did that go? And I mean, that's a very complicated, but Bill Koch was very patient with me to help me understand how all that worked and what as did Hal. But there was an extraordinary level of agreement this many years later, and I thought that was profound.
You know, one of the, sure, question.
I'm curious if anyone heard from Ray Blanton in the days following this. Did either the speakers or Bill Leach, did anybody hear from Ray Blanton?
I can give you, I did not, with an exception. Vanderbilt did a archive last year, and the librarian is here, of my papers as governor, and I thought it was just a bunch of junk that nobody would bother. They found all kinds of things in there. One thing they found was an envelope hand addressed to me with Ray Blanton's return address on it, and in it was the key to the governor's office. He had mailed that to me.
And later on that night, I went back to my office, and we had codophones in those days, you know, with the blinking little red lights, and I pushed the button, and it was the governor's highway patrolman, I guess. I can't remember his name. They said, Mr. Hardin, this is so-and-so. The governor wants you to call him. And it was a very poignant moment. But talking about resistance, I think one person that did resist was the governor's counsel, who was walking out of his office with the commutations. And you could,
Louis stopped him, right?
Tell that story.
Well, Eddie Sisk was no longer the governor's counsel. He'd been arrested middle of the month before, and so Judge Robert Lillard of Nashville was the governor's legal counsel. And so when Tom Ingram, Bill Koch, and Louis Donaldson went up to secure the Capitol, they made their way down to Judge Lillard's office on the ground floor, and he was preparing some final paperwork and was putting it in his briefcase, and Louis Donaldson says, Bob, you can't leave. And he says, well, I'm taking these to the governor. He says, no, you're not. It's a very tense moment, a very, very critical moment in this story. And he says, well, I just, well, what do we get? He said, I'll need to get the governor on the phone. He says, well, get him on the phone. Calls, he's not immediately available, but Bob Lillard says, well, you can take the papers. I'm going home. My work here is done. The phone rings, and it's Governor Blanton. And Judge Lillard answers, and he says, well, yes, sir, he's sitting right here. And he says, it's Governor Blanton, and Louis says, I'll talk to him. And he says, they tell me you say he can't bring me my papers. And he says, that's right. He says, well, I'll come to the Capitol. And Mr. Donaldson says, no, you will not. I mean, I hope you feel some of the heaviness of this exchange.
Well, Lillard is about 6'8".
Well, right. These are two extraordinary individuals, very distinguished people.
Well, and the rest of that conversation is by, Blanton says to Louis, by whose authority? And Louis says, by the governor's authority. And Blanton says, I am the governor. And Louis said, not anymore.
So, no, Bill Leach told you you were not the governor.
Yeah.
He says, well, I'll come down there, and Louis says, I won't let you in.
Question? Yes. Connie Dowell, the dean at Vanderbilt Library.
Keel, when did you start the book? What inspired you to start the book? This is a few years later. Why is it coming out now, maybe not 10 or 15 years ago?
That's a good question. It took me about 1.5 years to write it. Finished it about 1 year or so ago. Sue Havlish with the Vanderbilt University Press is in the back of the room. Sue, thank you. She and her colleagues took some time to do their good work, and I'd like to also recognize Richard McCarty, who linked me up with the Vanderbilt University Press, Vice Chancellor, and Beth Fortune, Vice Chancellor, is also here. So it took a while for the press to do their work. Probably the better answer, though, is that the research, all these interviews, you know, which actually took me, it was fun to do because it took me back to my reporter days, and in some ways, this book is as much about journalists as it is about politicians. But that took a while. So we probably started the interviews 5, 6 years ago, and people were very patient with me.
I'm going to ask the last question, and I'll ask the senator. I know these were 6 tough hours, unforgettable hours. As Honey said, the worst day of her life. What about the days following? How did what happened that day impact your administration over the next 4 years?
Well, if it'd be tough for the country, but if every United States senator serving today had a 6-hour boot camp like I had for how to get along with the opposite party, the country would be better off. And, you know, this didn't really occur to me until we started talking about this, but I didn't really know Ned McWhorter and John Wilder and Bill Leach. I mean, I knew them, but we'd met, but we had never worked together. And I was this new young Republican governor in this Democrat establishment that had grown up over a half-century. I mean, everything was Democratic. I mean, the newspaper, the lobbyists, the Supreme Court. I mean, everything was. And so how was this going to work? You know, for the next 4 years, hopefully 8 from my point of view. But in that 4 or 5 hours, we found a way to work together on something that was more difficult than anything else we'd ever deal with in the next 4 or 8 years, and developed a level of trust and respect for one another, and that carried on the whole time. And so when we got into how are we going to, you know, pay for the road program, are we going to borrow money or raise taxes, when we got into how are we going to deal with the National Education Association on rewarding outstanding teaching, when we got into all those things, we had a way to do it. and we got a result. And so I was lucky. We survived that 4 or 5 hours, and it gave me a boot camp of how to get along with some really very good people, and who I was privileged to work with during those 8 years. And I've always, while Hal wasn't one in the state government that I worked with, I've always, well, I've never really told him, admired his courage and making the call that day.
You know, this afternoon, Hal and I and some others who were here were in the Supreme Court room listening to John Hooker and Deputy Attorney General Kleinfelder argue a case. And I will tell you, for my part, the ghosts of 34 years were still there. It was a stunning moment in the history of the state. I thank you, Lamar, and you, Hal, for your leadership navigating us across that stormy sea during those 6 hours. Keel, thank you for recording it all in a wonderful book. I'll ask all of you to join me in thanking these three panelists for